The second topic of recent news attention is voter ID. And as we tape this program around the U.S., voter ID is playing out in many states, like more than 20 states. Here, voter ID is not exactly the same as in other states, but it's still out there, right? So,
yes.
Kate, what's the current story with voter ID? Where are we headed with this?
Well, it's a long and complicated and heart-wrenching story. Many states have begun implementing voter ID laws. They differ, the requirements differ in every state. Some are very restrictive in terms of what they will accept for identification at the polls. So the idea is, whereas 5 years ago, if you walked into your polling place in Rhode Island, they would just ask you your name and address and you would be able to vote. With an ID law, you are required to prove your identity at the polls. Rhode Island has implemented a voter ID law, and it's being phased in. So that's to say that currently, when you go to the polls, there are a number of forms of identification that have a photo that would be sufficient, and there are very few items that do not have a photo that would be acceptable for this year and next year.
The early part of the phase-in.
Right, correct. And then as the law stands now, as of 2014, we would go to a more strict requirement, which would require a photo ID. So items such as a social security card or a birth certificate, which are acceptable this year, would not be acceptable in 2014. The Disability Law Center joined the ACLU and others in opposing the voter ID law because of our concerns based on studies and what we see in the field that, in my case, that people with disabilities may not have the forms of ID that are required, and that it may be burdensome for them to obtain the ID or the underlying documents needed to even try to get the ID they need. And our efforts were not successful, so we do have this law in place now, and so our focus is education to make sure that people with disabilities understand what the requirements are, and we are certainly hoping to hear from anybody who feels that it's a barrier for them, because we would like to know about that.
Okay, so Rhode Island's version of voter ID is similar to other states. Are we very restrictive? Are we during the phase-in? That's one thing. So people could bring in documentation, didn't have pictures. But in 2014, and when we reach the full implementation of the law, will we look like those 20 other states that have gotten pretty restrictive?
I think there's an argument that we're not as strict as the most concerning laws. However, that doesn't make it any less difficult for a person who's shut in and has trouble getting out to get an ID. Currently will accept a RIPTA pass because RIPTA passes have a photo ID on them, and I think I haven't seen that in other state laws.
What we also have, which I don't know that a lot of other states have, is the Secretary of State's office offering these free voter IDs, which are really not that difficult to get, if I am remembering correctly.
That's correct.
And there's these, they're going around the state and doing them at senior centers and the like. That still doesn't completely take care of the problem for an individual who works from 9 to 5, doesn't have an identification, and cannot get to the Secretary of State to get this free ID. They're going to have a difficult time voting. And other people, who have difficulties moving around, who the buses would be prohibitively burdensome to take, anything like that. The Secretary of State's free voter ID program isn't going to take care of the concerns for those individuals.